Hey DEI fans, design engineering ideas. Time for another video. This time I'm going to show you a couple things that I designed and built at my shop. I know not always do I have pictures, but this time I do. I've talked a little bit about my go-karts, and I had one where I put a 8 horsepower cast iron Briggs & Stratton engine on a conventional go-kart, very light frame and all. And I milled the head too much to the point I had to put two gaskets on it, two head gaskets, because I couldn't hardly turn it over. And anyway, after I got done playing with it, I had a motor sitting there, and my brother-in-law had a set of wheels off of his Opel, and so we decided to make ourselves a log splitter. All we needed was a control valve and a hydraulic pump, and of course a cylinder, and away we went. And I welded it up all completely, put a hitch on it, and this is what we ended up with. Now I'm going to get it in here close enough. So we ended up having ourselves a log splitter for a while, but then, like everything, we ended up selling it. But it looked cool, especially with the wheels on it. Had some halfway decent fat tires, and it worked really good. I wouldn't want to use it for a lot of splitting, but just for your home use, it did all right. I will say one thing we learned about it, though. You gotta watch this. Your I-beam that supports the splitter end, make sure that's tough enough, because after we did some splitting, if a log that you had an angle cut on the end or something like that that made it screwy, when you got pressure against it, that whole beam would twist. And so we ended up having to weld braces in underneath there to stop that from happening. But most of them today use a heavy H-beam on its side. Is that the right way of saying it? Anyway, it's an H-beam. And it's a lot thicker. You'll see that on them. And that keeps them from twisting, where ours was a thinner I-beam. So you keep that in mind if you're going to build yourself one. Next project was one that actually really carried my business in a lot of respects. This was a repeat job from the Southern States store up in Tawnytown. They had fertilizer spreaders you could rent and take them out, of course, and do your own fertilizing. They would fill them up for you with whatever combination of dry fertilizer that you wanted, and you take them out on the field. Now these things had real large tires and was a single axle, but they weren't really designed to last forever, and they had come to the point of their useful life was ending. And the first thing that happened is they had one that the frame underneath broke. Now you can see it's rusted all the way through, and that is actually a box tube, which is not even a real piece of tubing. That is a 2 pieces of sheet metal folded at a 90, then welded together to make a box, to make a piece of tubing. And they had the axle welded inside the box. So that box would allow water to get inside the frame and rust it from the inside out. When you're dealing with fertilizer, it's a big no-no to have anything where the metal is not exposed. Wherever there's a hole that it can seep into and then just sit there and rust away, it will. So when I would get one, and sometimes I actually went out in the fields to pick them up. This one, I believe I was able to drive it back to, or tow it back to the shop. But when I would get one of these, I would do a complete rebuild. Now, I don't show the back end, but I took all of the spinners and all the bearings off of it, everything. And I'd strip it down, and I'd cut that box tubing out from underneath of the rest of the frame, the bin. And then I put in an H-beam, which you can see here. Now there's a piece of dirt on there. You need to ignore that. I don't know why I didn't bother clearing that off, but I didn't. That's kind of the way I do things. I just took a picture for me. I wasn't thinking about other people having to look at it. But there was a couple other problems with these spreaders. Besides them rusting out, the main frame rusting out, they also, the axles themselves would break. I had to pick 1 or 2 of them up out in fields with our lowboy trailer and drag them back in because the axle broke. Every one of them, there was a fracture beginning, even on the ones that didn't break, but where there was a fracture happening at the top and bottom of the axle at its, where the larger back bearing went against a face. Right there it would crack. And if you watch these things going down the road when they were empty, they bounced, and people didn't care the way they drove them. They just went as crazy as could be. And of course they drove the same way in the fields too. So these things took a lot of abuse. So I would actually, out of mild steel, don't remember the number, but it was cold rolled mild steel, I would machine new axles for them. I believe they were actually a little better because I think they had a little more flex to them than the original ones. They didn't seem quite as hard to machine. So that was another thing that you might say improved on them. Also, the bearings on them were all greasable pillow block bearings. Now, that seems to be a good idea, but the fact is the bearings didn't get greased. So why have greasable type? I replaced them with sealed bearings. Sealed bearings come with a better seal on them to keep the grease in. And like I said, once they wear out, it doesn't take that much to just replace them. So if they would come back with a worn out bearing, it only took me, a half hour to take my torch, and I would cut the balls out. That would get the 2 pieces apart. And with the balls out, I could get the outer race out of the pillow block, and the inner race a lot of times would come off because it had been heated for so long. And if it didn't, I actually could take my torch and slice down the side of it and make it come apart that way. So any way you looked at it, I got it apart. Which actually, I'll bring up another thing. Believe it or not, you can torch the nut off of a bolt and not destroy the threads on the bolt. Now, it takes a little bit of practice, but it is very doable, and I did it many times. Sometimes I wanted to save the bolt because of the size of it and something special about it. I mean, sometimes it was just a standard, 3/8 or half-inch bolt, and so I didn't really care. But other times it was something special, so I would do my best to save it. And the way I would go about it is I wouldn't cut with the shaft. I would cut with the threads. And as you went through the nut, you would see the threads appear as you cut through it on the sides, and you would cut it on either side, and then you had two pieces left, top and bottom, or however they were oriented, and then you would hit it with a hammer and it would come off, and you'd still have good threads. And I mean good, they weren't touched at all. Part of the secret is the bolt never got hot enough, and the nut, of course, being less volume to it, would take most of the heat, and then you could cut it off. So once I got the frame welded underneath of it and the axles and everything else, I would then send them to a sandblaster, and they would blast off all the old paint and the wheels as well, because they were showing signs of deterioration. And then, instead of the usual cheap as possible paint, I would put an epoxy primer on. It worked very well. It was made by DuPont. I don't think the company really matters. It's just the fact that it's an epoxy, which means it had to be mixed. It was a two-part system. And because it was sandblasted, the paint would adhere really, really well. After I got done putting the primer on it, I then went back and used Emron paint, which was expensive. There's no doubt about it. But you could see the difference in they weren't going to need to be painted again. That's just all there was to it. That's how good it was. So it was a good learning experience for me, and like I said, it held my shop out a lot. It was a good regular type of work. I knew every couple months I'd get one, and it worked out great for me, and it kept them going, and they didn't have to go out and buy all new fertilizer spreaders. So I hope you got something out of it, and talk to you next time.